Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Smart Talks by the Elizabeth Smart Foundation. I am Elizabeth, and I'm here with my co-host, Mio Strong, and I'm actually going to turn the time over to her today to introduce our very special guests.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us, everybody, on Smart Talks. Today, we are so excited to have Lynette Grable. She is the founder and director of Not Our Native Daughters. It is a nonprofit, and I'll have her tell us all a little bit more about that in a moment. And another guest, Kylie Hunson-Winter, who I personally know, and I have personally trained and rolled with, and have admired her from the very beginning. She is a self-defense teacher, and she focuses her efforts on the Native communities. They are probably the most underserved, one of the most underserved communities. She also has an online Instagram called Brave Woman, and that highlights women in different martial arts. And also, Kylie, really fast, do you mind telling us about where the name Brave Woman comes from? Because that is your name, correct?
Yeah. So my family is from the Standing Rock Sioux Dakota Lakota Nation. So my third great grandmother. So if you don't know, Indigenous people have their Indigenous name that is given to them from the medicine man. So my third great grandmother was named Brave Woman, and I am named after her. When I was a baby, my family brought me up to my family's reservation in North and South Dakota. And the medicine man named me Brave Woman after my third great grandmother because she was a woman warrior who, when she was only 14 years old, she fought in battle alongside her dad. And when she was fighting in battle, her dad died. And from that point on, she had to take a lead in the family, where from the whole life, she was a woman warrior. She had to fend for herself and fend for everyone else. Like when she went down to one of the camps, there was a man that she met who was an Irishman, and she was looking to save her family. And so she told him that, she said, if you give me horses, if you give me food and supplies so that my family can escape to Canada, I'll marry you. And she ended up living her entire life with this man and had kids with him. So he is my grandpa, but she did that in order to save her family and her life. And I think me being named after a brave woman is a great honor. And I also love that I'm able to share that with other people through my Instagram.
Yeah, I love that. And Lynette, do you mind telling us more about Not Our Native Daughters and a little bit more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've always been a public servant. Back probably when I was 25 years old, I started to, when I lived in Los Angeles, California, I started feeding the homeless and doing projects with providing shelter and stability for families. Part of that was dealing with single mothers with children who are also in need. And so that led me to a bigger fight to help more people, specifically for Native Americans. I spent 4 years in the as a counselor and as a mentor at the Florence Federal Detention Center in Arizona. And again, I was helping women. I was helping the women's unit. And so every time I moved in a different season in my life, I found myself helping more and more women who were in need. And along those lines of servanthood, I found out that most of the women that I came in contact with were Native American women. And at that time, in 2013, I didn't find much that was doing anything for Native American women, both off and on the reservation. There was very little any organizations or efforts for them to reach out to. In my work of working with people who were either women who were homeless or women who were found themselves in prison, in confinement, the common thread with these women were that they were either sexually assaulted, they were trafficked, they were sexually abused. And so I'm always trying to figure out what is the root of the problem in everything that I do. And I found the root of the problem of these women were that they had extreme trauma in their life, which I related to. I have trauma in my life and in my childhood as well. I was a homeless youth when I was 17 years old. And so I kind of related with some of the things that they were related to, and so I wanted to help these women get into a path where, because, recovery and self-stabilization is attainable. And that's what I was working to lead these women to, that you are able to be stable. You are able to overcome the trauma in your life. You are able to provide for your children. You are able to come to a healthy mental state without drugs and alcohol. So these were my efforts, and that was my goal. And it just seems like every step that I took in my own personal journey, I found myself helping more and more people. And, helping people is normal for me. It's a normal part of my life. My children do the same thing. Unintentionally, I've been raising advocates, like warrior women here, like Kylie. And so, I just like to be the bridge. And so in 2013, I started Not Our Native Daughters. It started out as mission work to help families in need on the reservation. And also I started to do healing circles for sexual assault prevention. One of the things that I found with working with women in need, Native American women in need, is that they didn't have an outlet to talk about it. And one thing I always say is, we have to reveal so that we can begin to heal. And so a lot of their suppression and their trauma was oppressed. So I did a lot of work working with women in need to help process and come into a healthy place where they can unravel their trauma. And me, it helped me along the way too. It was a healing source for me as well. So Not Our Native Daughters actually evolved into a training. I did human trafficking in Indian country. I do missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls trainings now. I did tons of hospitality trainings for tribal hotels and casinos. Tribal and hotels and casinos across the nation are a hot spot for exploitation. So I helped workers who work in the hospitality industry identify sex trafficking in their hotels or casino, or even on their reservation. And so I did that and I still do that for quite a bit of tribal communities. But I also worked for about 3-4 years as an advisor and instructor for Amber Alert as well. I helped with the human trafficking in Indian country trainings, trained a lot of law enforcement and social services. So in Not Our Native Daughters and bringing awareness. And now I think I would say for the past 2 years, I've also been advocating for mothers and fathers and family members of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, kind of like a personal mentor advocate to help them get justice. Because as you could imagine, when they're a child, or even if it is adult family member, when someone goes missing, they don't know the process on how to work with law enforcement, how to work with other entities of law enforcement, of justice systems. And so I try to fill in those gaps for families of MMIWG because they just don't have the focus, and then they're kind of traumatized of their missing family member. So I help them kind of be the liaison between the two. And I've been doing that now for 2 years, specifically for families of the Wind River Reservation that suffer from MMIWG.
Wow, I mean, you live such a service-oriented life, and it was only really in the last few years that I really actually learned, just how big a problem it is for Native women, for Native and Indigenous women. It seems, and tell me if I'm wrong, but from what I've learned and from the people that I've spoken to, it sounds like that it's not so much a question of if it happens, if you're a Native woman, but more a question of when it happens and how many times. Is that actually real, true, accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. Like you said, you hit it on the nail on the head. It's not about when, if it happens. It's about when it happens. Unfortunately, especially with the families that I've worked with and come alongside with and still advocate for them, of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, is that, especially I would say, especially for the tribes who live in probably Dakotas and the Western Plains area, Montana, Wyoming, of course, Nebraska. Unfortunately, and I really truly wish it wasn't this way. But the families also suffer from systemic and institutionalized racism because they don't get the attention that they need. I've specifically had law enforcement people tell me, oh, they probably were partying, or that girl was probably, with the wrong crowd. Regardless if she was drinking, regardless if she was with the wrong crowd that night, this young lady or this young man is still missing. And why is that even something that would pop into your head? It's not comforting. And it seems though that you categorize missing Native young people to be at a fault of their own to go missing. And this is what hurts me, and this is what I face in the fight for advocating for these families, because this is the stuff I kind of hear from law enforcement. And I'm a bit advocate. I worked with law enforcement. I'm a fan of law enforcement. I believe that they put themselves on the front lines, but there's a few of them out there, but just because of the color of their skin, they're not as important. And one of the things I say in my trainings is, if we have a 10-year-old Native girl that goes missing on our reservation, they're not going to be on the 6 o'clock news, but, if we have a white girl missing at 10 years old, they will definitely be on all the news outlets that night. So we face a lot of different institutionalized racism when it comes to our missing persons, not only on the law enforcement side, but also on the media side. But things like this, having people talk about it and understand it, this is how we begin to grow those bridges and make people understand what we face on reservations, because most communities have a reservation in their backyard, or so to speak. And so this is how we can come together to overcome that, because I'm before you on this screen a full-blooded Native American woman, but the statistics that hang over my head is that I am the most stalked, raped, sexually assaulted, and murdered out of all ethnicities in this nation. And I also suffer domestic violence 50 times higher than the national average. And again, the resources that are out there for nonprofits and NGOs and NPOs and all the great people doing great work out there, I don't have a lot of resources for me if I fall into those categories. And in some of those categories, I actually am a survivor of those categories. And so this is what we face as Native people.
It just kind of, it blows my mind that, statistics are as high as they are. And that there is so little being done, so little being reported, so little resources available to you. Why do you think Native women are so targeted?
I think that we are forgotten. I think we are not deemed as important as other ethnicity women in this country. I don't believe that some, I wouldn't say all, but there's some people in our society where I live, I face blatant and hostile racism. When I lived in Arizona, I didn't have to face that. I faced a diversity, equality type of environment. I didn't have to go to the stores within that where I lived in Arizona. I never had to face, that type of treatment. But where I live now, I have to face that treatment everywhere I go. When I go into town, when I go into a store, the treatment, how I'm treated versus somebody who is non-Native, or, I would just say white, is very blatant and very in your face. So I think because some people, and not all, but some people have that mentality, we're less than valued when it comes to crimes that happens against us, if we're murdered, whether if we're missing. This past winter, we had a young girl that was missing for some time. Law enforcement didn't want to put too much effort in it because she was known as somebody who would party. And in the result of that, she was found in a field, frozen to death. And there was little that we were able to do as a community, and even her family, when law enforcement don't want to put the effort forth to look for us and investigate it. You could probably talk to any Native American that is out there, and they will probably have a missing or a murdered person in their own family, which I do.
Yeah,
You know, it goes back to that point you made about we have to reveal in order to heal. That statement you made gave me chills because it's such a cycle, right? It's going to be harder and harder and harder for these families and women to come forward if they feel like it falls on deaf ears. I mean, it's so painful anyways. And you're right with nobody's going to be on the 6 o'clock news if they're, and that's part of, initially getting the support from law enforcement, from the community, from everybody else to find and solve these crimes. Kylie, your dad had shared with me just the story of his mother. Mm-hmm. And do you mind sharing that with us? And
yeah. So my grandmother, she grew up on the Standing Rock Reservation as a young girl. She's a traditional Native woman, and of course with the MMIWG movement, she's faced so much stuff in her life, and just through her lifetime, mainly when she was younger, she's been sexually assaulted or raped 5 or 6 times in her life. So many of them, she's a veteran. She was raped when she was serving. She was raped throughout her adulthood, but the first time that she was sexually assaulted on her reservation was actually when she lived in a cabin with her parents, and her parents weren't home. When there was a man who was a white man who came onto the reservation, I believe, and he went into her cabin, and she ran for the woods, and she was hiding for hours because she knew there was a stranger in her home. She didn't know why he was there, and she didn't know what he was doing, and she sat out in the woods and she waited for hours hoping that he would be gone because her parents weren't there. And she was a very young girl. I believe she was like 6 years old, maybe. And she, after a few hours, she went back to her house and she found the man there. He had never left, and because she had no one else there for her, he raped her. And this is just the first of many instances that my grandmother has faced in our society. And I mean, right now she's in her 80s, she's lived through a lot. And the fact that someone has to endure such a pain even once is horrific, and it just keeps happening over and over. And this is the reality for so many of our Indigenous women, and it just makes it worse when it's looked over too. So yeah.
I don't even have words. I mean, like, I know what it's like to be raped, but 5 or 6, like, separate, different by different people. Like, yeah. I mean, as a survivor, like, for me, I think, getting over what I did, it was hard. It took a lot. I don't know if I could do it again. I definitely don't think I could do it 5 or 6 times. That makes me want to throw up.
Yeah.
Is that where you draw a lot of your strength and passion and motivation, Kylie? I mean, knowing her story, knowing your lineage.
For sure. My grandma, she's a really strong woman. She's lived through so much. She was in the boarding schools when she was a young girl. She grew up in the boarding schools where she was assaulted there too, where you hear so many stories about these boarding schools where they were physically beaten, they were sexually assaulted, they were stripped of their culture, stripped of their language, where they were forced into the Westerners or the white man's ways, where they thought they had to be civilized and that they had to be changed. And with how much that has happened to my grandmother, not only being sexually assaulted, but like she's been hit by a streetcar in San Francisco, and like she almost died then. And the fact that she's able to keep going and have had such an amazing life, it's amazing to me, and it really helps me to inspire other people. Like with my Instagram page, Gray Woman, I'm predominantly focused on all women in martial arts, and that stems from my own experience being a young girl, growing up, starting in karate and jiu-jitsu and all that stuff, where I see my own suppression and my own struggles that I've had, but I know that they're only a fraction of what so many other people have faced. Because the truth is that the color of my skin and my fact that I have red hair makes my reality way different than my relatives, where I know that people aren't going to profile me when they see me just because I don't appear Native American, even though I am. And it's just a horrible thing to know. But I know that what happens to my relatives, and it's so dear and close to me that I have to stand up for it.
And do you think that's part of why your parents put you in martial arts at such a young age, giving you the tools?
Yeah, I think for sure, because obviously my dad knows what his mom has been through and so many of our relatives and friends. And of course, just being a woman in society, but especially an Indigenous woman, being able to defend yourself is such a huge thing. I know that when I was little, I think it was kind of a turning point in martial arts where the generation just before me, there were hardly any women. And as I grew up, I started to see the more girls that were there to support me. But when I was young, starting in karate, there were not very many. There were hardly any my age. And even the ones that were there were very few to look up to. And I think that really with anything in sprouting into myself to work for the MMIW movement, it's like seeing someone there who knows what you've been through, who can relate to you is a huge thing that not a lot of people know how much it can mean to you. So I want to be that person for other people with what I do. And in my experience, I pull from what my family has been through, from what we know is happening and what has gone on. And I hope that someone else can see it and they can know that they're not alone and that there's someone there to help them.
I think that's amazing. You're an amazing, courageous woman.
Thank you.
And Kylie, you're only 17.
Yeah, I am.
I find it so remarkable that this is the path that you found at such a young age. It's amazing. Lynette, do you mind going into just a little bit more of the missing, murdered Indigenous women's, the issues, and what can we do? What can we as non-natives that are horrified by what we've learned over the last several years, what are some action items we can do? What can we do?
First of all, I think talking about it helps the MMIW movement a lot. The more people talking about it, the reason why there's a MMIWG movement, not only is because of the issue and it came from grassroots organizing, but it's because people are saying, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many times people told me, I cannot believe that this is statistics for Native American women and youth. So the more we talk about it, I think the more we're going to be able to get innovating ideas on how to address the issue, and then prevention, of course. On another level of trying to solve the issue, or at least begin to put some action behind the issue, is to support the federal legislation bills. For about 2.5, almost 3 years, I worked on Not an Invisible Act, and also the Savannah's Act, and they have little traction and very little movement in these past couple years. I spent a lot of time on the Hill lobbying for these bills, meeting with both sides of the aisle and in Congress on how to push these bills through, worked on amendments on how to make them better, met with law enforcement on how we can address this issue. But I think one of the biggest issues for any crime in the country is that we need to get BIA, which is reservation law enforcement, on board with the other entities of law enforcement. I proposed the governor here in Wyoming last year to have an MMIW task force, which when he created. I'm on that task force, and I'm also on the human trafficking task force. But one of the things that I saw a big gap in is that our law enforcement were not on the same page. Our sheriff department, our Homeland Security, our local PDs, and then our BIA. And so all of them together at the same table, one of the law enforcement said, we've never been at the same table ever. And so that is very important, especially when we're dealing with somebody who's missing. Usually when they're missing, they're off the reservation. So if, we have other entities of law enforcement that needs to be, be involved in that. So I think that's very important. I think that needs to happen nationwide. I think law enforcement, whether it's through a MMIW task force or whether it's just through, initiative efforts of people in leadership, making sure that law enforcement are all on the same page, because the right hand don't know what the left hand is doing. And usually when it comes to families who come to me and say, I've never got justice for my missing daughter back in I have to trace it back to who in law enforcement and saying, oh, well, BIA was handling it. Oh no, sheriff department was handling it. And so we have this kind of web of who was handling it, and then everybody's blaming on who dropped the ball. Meantime, the families still spend years and years of never getting an answer, never getting a follow-up call, never getting anything on their investigation for their missing son or their missing daughter. And even if the bodies are unfortunately, if they end up dead or passing away, there's still a little bit of traction after that to gain justice. One of the trainings that I do is called No Clear Avenue to Justice in Indian Country, and it talks about the bureaucracy of the different law enforcement entities. And some states have, like, we don't have in Arizona, there is one, but Attorney General's office to run to get cases to elevate to that level. And so there's also these webs. I work with victims, families, and even victims, Native girls who've been sexually assaulted or molested. And again, these cases seem to drop by the wayside. An old statistic for BIA law enforcement that crimes that BIA have handled is that only 38% of BIA cases get investigated, and that's not even prosecuted. That's just an investigation rate, So yeah, so what happened to the 62% that never even got an investigation? So these are the numbers, and these are the hard conversations that we have to talk about. I'm not into putting anybody on blast or putting the blame anywhere. I'm more focused on how can we get to a resolution, how can we work to fix the hiccups in the past, and how can we begin to get justice for families and people from the reservation. Because if it affects one community, it affects all, whether it's non-native land, tribal land or not. And so we just need to come to the same table of understanding and a willingness. We need to see a willingness of justice. And then sometimes that's hard to do.
I think what you just said, that you're not here to like put blame on whoever it is. You're about moving forward and getting like results and changing the future and working together. I mean, to me, that just speaks to me that you are such an example and a leader to follow. I mean, what a voice you've become for so many women and girls. Like, you're just amazing. And I think it's just inspiring. I have a couple questions as well for both you and Kylie. Right now we are in, I'd say, the middle of the largest civil rights movement that the world has ever seen. Do you feel like that as an Indigenous Native woman, do you feel like you are a part of that, or do you feel like you still haven't even been able to reach into this civil rights movement that's going on right now?
To me, it seems, I think that police reform and everything going on right now will have a positive benefit for everyone, especially minority communities, Indigenous people, the Black community. I think it is going to have a huge impact for everyone. And everything happening right now is amazing, and I'm so glad that proper change is being addressed and hopefully is going to be made in a proper way. I think that for the Indigenous women and our Indigenous peoples, it's a bit more complicated than the current issues that are being addressed. The reservation laws are much different than any state or any city. Everything going on right now, personally, I actually have protested with the Black Lives Matter movement here in Phoenix, Arizona. Completely peaceful protests. I marched. It was an amazing experience. And when I was there, actually, I saw some of because there's a lot of Indigenous people here in Arizona. And I could smell sage, and I saw my Indigenous people there with me. And I think that the huge thing of this right now is us all coming together in unity. And there are so many steps that need to be taken, so much that needs to be changed. And we stand together with the Black community and what is happening right now. And we push forward for change for them, because everyone stood with us with Standing Rock when we protested the pipeline. And we hope that we can move forward and find change for the Indigenous people as well.
And what do you think, Lynette?
You know what? I think that's a great question. I am a supporter of a Black Lives Matter movement. I definitely have protested with the Black Lives Matter here locally, that we had some protests here and some rallies, and we had some panelist conversations over it. I do think that police reform is something that needs to be addressed. I've worked with good cops, and nobody likes bad cops, no more than good cops. A cop will tell you that. And so, we have to not also understand that a few bad cops don't make all the good cops bad too. And so we have to be able to have that conversation about how Black people are affected by being profiling. Native Americans are profiled too by law enforcement. And so my hope is, because of this movement and this organizing that we're seeing nationwide, is that I am in hopes that this conversation will also lead into other injustices conversation, and Native Americans being part of that conversation. Because if you look at numbers of statistics of Native Americans also have a high rate of being killed by law enforcement. But again, it goes back to what I said earlier. We are not in media. We are not in the newspaper. Our statistics don't make it to the front page. If a Native American man, and we had one last year locally here in Wyoming, we had a Native American Northern Arapaho man from my tribe that was killed at Walmart. His story did not make it to the news. His story did not make it to the front page of the paper, like George Floyd has. And I'm not here to dilute the Black Lives Movement, because that is basically what is being proclaimed by the Black Lives Movement is necessary and is needed, and I stand with them in solidarity. But I'm only making a comparison to when a Native American is killed by law enforcement, which this person was last year in our community. It wasn't nowhere in the media. And so, again, because of the injustices that is faced by the Black community, I have high hopes that the conversation will continue, and we could talk about the statistics of Native Americans who are killed by law enforcement as well. Not only who are killed by law enforcement, but also we can carry on that conversation about the investigation rate for felony and missing and murdered crimes for Indigenous people in the hands of law enforcement, and how can we make that better?
I mean, if there's anything that the foundation, that the Elizabeth Smart Foundation or I personally can do to help, I know we will be right there with you. One of the things that I think it's really actually important to bring up, that once again, I only learned this within the last year, and Kylie just mentioned it. And so sorry, I know I'm jumping all over the place a little bit, but she mentioned how there are completely different laws governing people on the reservations versus off. And I didn't actually realize that. I thought if a reservation was in a state, it just was part of those state laws, but that's not true. I mean, a reservation is a sovereign nation, right? So you just have different laws that govern you, as opposed to me living out in, suburbia, Utah.
That's correct. There's 567 tribal sovereign nations in the U.S., and we all have our own sovereign nation and we have tribal laws and codes that we have to abide by, but also we all have different culture. What one tribe practices culturally might be totally different, like what is celebrated in the Western tribes or East Coast tribes. So we're all uniquely different within the United States. And yes, the sovereignty of tribal nations versus the laws and codes that is upheld within our throughout our country is a lot different. And that's part of our problem as well, is that because of the restrictions between federal to federal relationships, and when I mean federal to federal relationships, I mean sovereign nation to the federal government or a sovereign nation to the state government. There's bad blood between in those issues because of history, and there's historical trauma within those relationships as well. And again, that adds to the fuel of why we face the atrocities that we do in Indian country. So yes, we do have our own laws, but for example, the reason why there's a VAWA Act, Violence Against Women Act, which I hope to see, reassigned or readdressed in the next administration, is because if a non-native comes on a reservation and he attacks or rapes one of our people, tribal law enforcement, BIA, does not have authority to obtain him. They have to call either sheriff department or an outside rural law enforcement, and by that time, that person is probably free to go. They're taken off. They're not going to wait for another law enforcement. Yeah,
and
so that's another reason why we have high rates.
So that is why.
I'm sorry, say that again.
You answered my question with your last comment, but that is why why a lot of Native women are targeted so highly, and why so many of these predators are able to slip through the cracks. They go onto the reservation to rape or murder or abuse the women who live there, and then as soon as they're done, they get out. They get off the reservation so that they're not prosecuted, so that they're not detained, so that basically nothing is done.
Right.
And there's
That's
like
correct.
You mentioned, the different laws for the different sovereign nations, tribe to tribe, it's also difficult, right? Kylie, I think your dad was mentioning that to me.
Yeah, because every sovereign nation, obviously, they are able to establish their own laws within similarly, sovereign nations are only, they only have to listen to the federal government. They're not under the state, they're not under the cities. And like Lynette was saying, this is where a huge issue with jurisdiction comes in. And I think in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement and reform, especially with our reservations being sovereign nations, with our law enforcement, no matter which agency it is, our biggest issue right now is their number one priority should be the safety of the people and to be able to help the people. Right now, they are focusing on enforcing the laws, but the issue is that the laws that we have in place are not efficient for the people. With our Native American people, and it makes it even more complicated, where if somebody goes missing, if somebody is murdered or kidnapped or raped, your number one priority should be able to help them, to be able to bring proper justice to the situation, or be able to find somebody who is lost. But because of the way our justice system is set up right now, there are many occurrences where they're like, oh no, sorry, we can't go over there, and we can't do that, and we can't save this person because this law says I can't do that. Which their number one priority is not going to be enforcing their laws. It's going to be, or it shouldn't be, it should be to help the people. And the laws need to change so that we can have the proper circumstances. And this isn't just the federal government to the reservations or to the cities or anything like that, but from reservation to reservation, it's different. We have our own forms of government. Just like a city or a state has their governor and everyone below them, we have our tribal government that we elect within ourselves, because it's not only just putting in laws, it's our culture. This is different than the rest of our politics in the United States. Our culture is a part of our reservations, it's a part of our way of life, and it is especially in our government. And I think another issue that comes up is the cultural references and the cultural relation in how this is enforced and used is much different than anything in the States. And this clashes a lot too, where many times jurisdictions they'll have a disrespect or maybe a non-understanding of how things are different on the reservation.
And it sounds like it's just as difficult for change within a sovereign nation as it is just as difficult to see change in the United States within the federal government. I mean, you're really fighting two battles at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly true. We're fighting the federal one and the state one, and then a tribal one. And sometimes, in some cases, they throw that sovereignty back in our face when we're trying to attain justice outside of our sovereign nation authorities. So sometimes those things are brought up as, well, you're a sovereign nation, you handle it, and things of that nature. And really, we're just, the families or the tribe is just trying to obtain justice. So you're exactly right. We are fighting two battles at one time. And the families and the victims are the ones who lose.
Suffer.
We've talked about, we need to keep on talking about this. We need to help raise the volume on these issues. But do you have any other suggestions or organizations we can do to help support you and to help support the issues that you are working on?
I think for me, like a major part that I take in it is the self-defense. Lynette has done amazing work with her organization, and I think she is a great resource. You should definitely check out her stuff, and that's a great way to start. But I think one of the major issues is that the resources aren't there right now. The Indigenous community is largely underserved, especially in self-defense, where a lot of the reservations don't even have anyone who's trained to teach them, anyone who's trained to help them. That's one of the major things that I've done personally, where I've traveled to Montana, I've traveled to Georgia, I've done a lot of things locally where I teach Indigenous women because I know they don't have the resources. There's supposed to be a documentary coming out about a school that's teaching boxing on the reservation. I think that's great because they're trying to fight against the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement so that they can defend themselves. However, boxing is great, but the truth is a lot of fights end up on the ground. And I think that even on the resources we have, boxing isn't just enough. You need to be able to defend yourself in every manner. And I think developing these resources, finding ways for our Indigenous women to be able to defend themselves, finding people who can go out there and teach them, and figuring out a way to bring this resource to them that they don't have is a huge part of this.
And Kylie and I have talked briefly prior to this, and that's going to be on our docket for the foundation. I know Elizabeth and I are both 110% behind this idea of creating a program, getting the right people in the right spots, because once you do, and somebody in that community then can turn around and teach other communities, and it's this amazing, just like Elizabeth just mentioned, volume. It's adding volume to these issues. It's giving you the tools. And so, Kylie, we will be talking a lot more in the future about working together and actually taking action and steps to implement this plan, because that's our language. That's our common language. You and I speak, and we're both very passionate about making this happen. And I know the foundation is behind this as well. Lynette, what are your ideas as well?
Well, one of the things I always say is if we talk about our murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, then we have to talk about all the issues, the factors that stem that problem. One of the major factors of why there's a MMIWG movement is one of them is of course, as human trafficking is a big reason why we have an MMIWG movement. But also we have to talk about our extreme poverty. We have to talk about our extreme poverty. We have to talk about, we mentioned and we talked about this, our lack of law enforcement, our lack of justice. And then we have to talk about what do we have on our reservations for prevention and awareness. And that's one of the things that I've worked on, is to make sure that we get the prevention out there, the awareness out there, not only in this state and my own reservation, but other reservations I visited. I teach youth to recognize not only what is human trafficking, what is child sex trafficking, but what do you do when you get sexually assaulted? Most youth, of course, when they're sexually assaulted or anything along those lines, you know, they bottle up and they don't say nothing. And so those are the type of resources. Sexual assault prevention and awareness is very huge and is needed on the reservation. And so I would, and I worked with I have so many other partnerships and organizations across the nation that I work with, that I partner with, that are good friends of mine. I feel like we're all doing different work in different pockets of the nation, but we're basically doing the same thing. We're educating, we're training, I've done a lot of work, and I know some of my partners have done a lot of work training even other organizations or other entities, even on the state level and the government level, teaching them how to work with tribal communities, teaching them how to partner up. That's one of the things that are missing on the reservation, is that, you know, you'll have something going on the reservation where they're doing prevention, they're doing awareness, they're working with their youth, they're doing things to bring initiative and hope to young people, or even just the community itself, but the funding doesn't last forever. It only lasts as long as the grant lasts, and then the initiative and that work dies down. I faced that for myself, and so you know, funding is a huge need across any country, especially for us smaller ones on a grassroots level that don't get the bigger funding. And then another part of it is just seeing what other reservations are in your own state, in your own community. Has anybody ever reached out to them and worked with them? Because I can guarantee you, if you reached out to your own nearby reservations, they're going to tell you what their need is, and their need is going to be, you know, a lot of them, especially because I work with different other reservations, is if there is a victim service programs, they're in need of diapers, they're in need of things that they have to give to their safe houses, to their victims, or domestic violence shelters. There's always a huge need there, and I'd be happy to connect you to other resources and partnerships that I have, but the need is overwhelming. So, you know, back to what I started with, if we talk about one problem, we have to talk about all the other problems that stem that issue.
Wow. Yes, do connect us. And let's keep this conversation going, because I don't want this to die down. I don't want this to end. I don't care what ethnicity people are, or the color of their skin, or their hair, or who they are. I mean, no human being should be raped. No human being should be abused or tortured or forgotten about or left behind. So I know Mio and I know the whole foundation will do whatever we can to help support you and see this move forward. For everyone watching today, I hope that this has meant something to you, because it certainly meant a lot to me, to hear that there are over 500 reservations in the United States of America. That's like 500 individual little tiny countries within the United States. That's amazing. And for them to say they're right in your own backyard, and one of the best places to begin to help, to make a difference, is by reaching out to those reservations that are right in your own backyard and seeing what you can do. I mean, let's not let this civil rights movement just end with Black Lives Matter. Let's help move this to Native and Indigenous people. And let's make this be an issue for all of humanity, not just one pocket or one group of people. Every person is important. Black people are important. Native and Indigenous people are important. Let's make sure this conversation extends to them. So reach out to your reservations that are close by. Look them up, who's in your state, see how you can support them, because hearing the numbers, realizing that if you are a Native woman, that it's not a question of if you get abused, it's a question of when. And unfortunately, as Kylie shared, her grandma, 5 or 6 times raped by different instances, not the same person over and over, 5 or 6 different people. I mean, that is just, it still makes me sick to my stomach. So let's end this. Let's make this end. Let's make this conversation loud so people can hear it. And with that being said, I know it's a very serious note, but I also have such a belief in humanity that we absolutely can make a difference, and that we need everyone to be involved in making that difference. I just encourage you to reach out, to learn more, to see how you can help. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you so much, Kylie and Lynette. You've just been amazing, and I look forward to having future conversations with you and hopefully working together and collaborating together again on more of these issues and bringing them to light. And with that being said, I want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you again, Lynette and Kylie. And we'll see you all again next time on Smart Talks. Bye-bye.